This is a podcast from the archives of the BBC Reith Lectures. This lecture in the series Representation of the Intellectual, given by Idwārd Saʿīd, was originally broadcast in 1993.
In my last lecture, I spoke about the way an intellectual can become a professional who's specialized in one bit of turf, accredited, careful, speaking not the general language of a wide audience, but rather the approved jargon of a group of insiders. For not only does this shield the individual from a coarse reality, it also gives one a sense of moral and certainly technical superiority. During the mid-1960s, just a short while before opposition to the Vietnamese War became very vocal and widespread, I was approached by an older-looking undergraduate student at Columbia for admission to a seminar with limited enrollment. Part of his line to me was that he was a veteran of the war, having served there in the Air Force. As we chatted, he provided me with a fascinatingly eerie glimpse into the mentality of the professional, in this case a seasoned pilot, whose vocabulary for his work could be described as insidees. I'll never forget the shock I received when, in responding to my insistent question, "What did you actually do in the Air Force?" he replied, "Target acquisition." It took me several more minutes to figure out that he was a bombardier whose job it was, well, to bomb. But he had coded it in a professional language that in a certain sense was meant to exclude and mystify the rather more direct probings of a rank outsider. I did take him into the seminar, by the way, perhaps because I thought I could keep an eye on him and, as an added inducement, persuade him to drop the appalling jargon. Target acquisition, indeed. In a more consistent and sustained way, I think, intellectuals who are close to policy formulation and can control patronage of the kind that gives or withholds jobs, stipends, promotions, tend to watch out for individuals who do not toe the line professionally, and in the eyes of their superiors, gradually come to exude an air of controversy and non-cooperation. Understandably, of course, if you want a job done, let us say that you and your team have to provide a government department with a policy paper on Bosnia by next week. You need to surround yourself with people who are loyal, share the same assumptions, speak the same language. I've always felt that for an intellectual who represents the kinds of things I've been discussing in these lectures, being in that sort of professional position where you are principally serving and winning rewards from power is not at all conducive to the exercise of that critical and relatively independent spirit of analysis and judgment that, from my point of view, ought to be the intellectual's contribution. In other words, the intellectual, properly speaking, is not a functionary or an employee completely given up to the policy goals of a government or a large corporation, or even a guild of like-minded professionals. In such situations, the temptations to turn off one's moral sense, or to think entirely from within the specialty, or to curtail skepticism in favor of conformity, are far too great to be trusted. Many intellectuals succumb completely to these temptations, and to a great degree, all of us do. No one is totally self-supporting, not even the greatest of free spirits. As an alternative, I suggested that as a way of maintaining relative intellectual independence, having the attitude of an amateur instead of a professional is a better course. But let me be practical and personal here. In the first place, amateurism means choosing the risks and uncertain results of the public sphere, a lecture or a book or article, in wide and unrestricted circulation, over the insider space controlled by experts and professionals. Several times over the past 2 years, I've been asked by the media to be a paid consultant. This I have refused to do simply because it meant being confined to one television station or journal, and confined also to the going political language and conceptual framework of that outlet. Similarly, I've never had any interest in paid consultancies to or for the government, where you would have no idea what use your ideas might later be put to. Secondly, delivering knowledge directly for a fee is very different if, on the one hand, a university asks you to give a public lecture, or if, on the other, you're asked to speak only to a small and closed circle of officials. That seems very obvious to me, so I've always welcomed university lectures and always turned down the others. And thirdly, to get more political, whenever I've been asked for help by a Palestinian group or by a South African university to visit and to speak against apartheid and for academic freedom, I have routinely accepted. In the end, one is moved by causes and ideas that one can actually choose to support because they conform to values and principles one believes in. I do not therefore consider myself bound by my professional training in literature, consequently ruling myself out for matters of public policy just because I am only certified to teach modern literature. I speak and write about broader matters because, as a rank amateur, I'm spurred on by commitments that go well beyond my narrow professional career. Of course, I make a conscious effort to acquire a new and wider audience for these views, which I never present inside a classroom. But what are these amateur forays into the public sphere all about really? Is the intellectual galvanized into intellectual action by primordial, local, instinctive loyalties to one's race or people or religion? Or is there some more universal and rational set of principles that can and perhaps do govern how one speaks and writes? In effect, I'm asking the basic question for the intellectual. How does one speak the truth? What truth? For whom? And where? Unfortunately, we must begin to respond by saying that there is no system or method that is broad and certain enough to provide the intellectual with direct answers to these questions. In the secular world, our world, the historical and social world made by human effort, the intellectual has only secular means to work with. Revelation and inspiration, while perfectly feasible as modes for understanding in private life, are disastrous and even barbaric when put to use by theocratically minded men and women. Indeed, I would go so far as saying that the intellectual must be involved in a lifelong dispute with all the guardians of sacred vision or text, whose depredations are legion, and whose heavy hand brooks no disagreement and certainly no diversity. Uncompromising freedom of opinion and expression is the secular intellectual's main bastion. To abandon its defense or to tolerate tamperings with any of its foundations are, in effect, to betray the intellectual's calling. That is why the defense of Salman Rushdie's satanic verses has been so absolutely central an issue, both for its own sake and for the sake of every other infringement against journalists, novelists, essayists, poets, historians. And not just those in the Islamic world, but also in the Jewish and Christian worlds too. Freedom of expression cannot be sought invidiously in one territory, ignored in another. For with authorities who claim the secular right to defend, define, decree, there can be no debate, no matter where they are. Whereas for the intellectual, tough, searching debate is the core of activity, the very stage and setting of what intellectuals without revelation really do. But we are back to square one. What truth and principle should one defend, uphold, represent? This is no Pontius Pilate's question, a way of washing one's hands of a difficult case, but the necessary beginning of a survey of where today the intellectual stands and what a treacherous, uncharted minefield surrounds him or her. Take as a starting point the whole, by now extremely disputatious matter of objectivity or accuracy or facts. In 1988, the American historian Robert Novick published a massive volume whose title dramatized the quandary with exemplary efficiency. It was called That Noble Dream and subtitled The Objectivity Question and the American Historical Profession. Drawing on materials taken from a century of the historiographic enterprise in the United States, Novick showed how the very nub of historical investigation, the ideal of objectivity by which a historian seizes the opportunity to render facts as realistically and accurately as possible, gradually evolved into a mass of competing claims and counterclaims. All of them wore down any semblance of agreement by historians as to what objectivity was, to the merest fig leaf, and often not even to that. Objectivity has had to do service in the Cold War as our, that is American as opposed to communist, truth, in peacetime as the objective truth of each competing separate group, women, African Americans, Asian Americans, gays, white men, and so on, and each school, Marxist, establishment, deconstructionist, cultural. After such a babel of knowledges, what possible convergence could there be, Novick asks, and he concludes mournfully that as a broad community of discourse, as a community of scholars united by common aims, common standards, and common purposes, the discipline of history had ceased to exist. The professor of history was as described in the last verse of the book of Judges. In those days there was no king in Israel. Every man did that which was right in his own eyes. As I said in my last lecture, one of the main intellectual activities of our century has been the questioning, not to say undermining, of authority. So to add to Novick's findings, we would have to say that not only did a consensus disappear on what constituted objective reality, but a lot of traditional authorities, including God, were in the main swept away. There has even been an influential school of philosophers, among whom Michel Foucault, the French thinker, ranks very high, who say that to speak of an author at all, as in the author of Milton's poems, is a highly tendentious, not to say ideological, overstatement. In the face of this quite formidable onslaught, to regress either into hand-wringing impotence or into muscular reassertions of traditional values, as characterized by the global neoconservative movement, will not do. I think it is true to say that the critique of objectivity and authority did perform a positive surface by underlining how, in the secular world, human beings construct their truth, so to speak, and that, for example, the so-called objective truth of the white man's superiority built and maintained by the classical European colonial empires also rested on a violent subjugation of African and Asian peoples. And they, it is equally true, fought that particular imposed truth in order to provide an independent order of their own. And so now everyone comes forward with new and often violently opposed views of the world. One hears endless talk about Judeo-Christian values, Afrocentric values, Muslim truths, Eastern truths, Western truths, each providing a complete program for excluding all the others. There is now more intolerance and strident assertiveness abroad everywhere than any one system can handle. The result is an almost complete absence of universals, even though very often the rhetoric suggests, for instance, that our values, whatever those may happen to be, are in fact universal. One of the shabbiest of all intellectual gambits is to pontificate about abuses in someone else's culture and to excuse exactly the same practices in one's own. For me, the classic case is that of the brilliant 19th century French intellectual, Alexis de Tocqueville, who, to many of us educated to believe in classical liberal and Western democratic values, exemplified those values almost to the letter. Having written his assessment of democracy in America and having criticized American mistreatment of Indians and black slaves, Tocqueville later had to deal with French colonial practices in Algeria during the late 1830s and 1840s, where, under Marshal Bugeaud, the French army of occupation undertook a savage war of pacification against the Algerian Muslims. All of a sudden, as one reads Tocqueville on Algeria, the very norms with which he had humanely demurred at American malfeasance are suspended for French actions. Not that he doesn't cite reasons, he does. But they are lame extenuations whose purpose it is to license French colonialism in the name of what he calls national pride. Massacres leave him unmoved. Muslims, he says, belong to an inferior religion and must be disciplined. In short, the apparent universalism of his language for America is denied, willfully denied, application to his own country, even as his own country, France, pursues similarly inhumane policies. It must be added, however, that Tocqueville, and John Stuart Mill for that matter, whose commendable ideas about democratic freedoms in England, he said, did not apply to India, lived during a period when the ideas of a universal norm of international behavior meant, in effect, the right of European power and European representations of other people to hold sway. So nugatory and secondary did the non-white peoples of the world seem. Besides, according to 19th century Westerners, there were no independent African or Asian peoples of consequence, to challenge the draconian brutality of laws that were applied unilaterally by colonial armies to black or brown-skinned races. Their destiny was to be ruled. Frantz Fanon, Aimé Césaire, and C.L.R. James, to mention three great anti-imperialist black intellectuals, did not live and write until the 20th century. So what they and the liberation movements of which they were a part accomplished culturally and politically in establishing the right of colonized peoples to equal treatment was not available to Tocqueville or Mill. But these changed perspectives are available to contemporary intellectuals who have not often drawn the inevitable conclusions that if you wish to uphold basic human justice, you must do so for everyone, not just selectively for the people that your side, your culture, your nation designates are okay. The fundamental problem is therefore how to reconcile one's identity and the actualities of one's own culture, society, and history to the reality of other identities, cultures, peoples. This can never be done simply by asserting one's preference for what is already one's own, tub-thumping about the glories of our culture or the triumphs of our history is not worthy of the intellectual's energy, especially not today when so many societies are comprised of different races and backgrounds, as to beggar any reductive formulas. As I have been discussing it here, the public realm in which intellectuals make their representations is extremely complex and contains contradictory features. But the meaning of an effective intervention there has to rest on the intellectual's unbudgeable conviction in a concept of justice and fairness that allows for differences between nations and individuals without at the same time assigning them to hidden hierarchies, preferences, evaluations. Everyone today professes a liberal language of equality and harmony for all. The problem for the intellectual is to bring these notions to bear on actual situations where the gap between the profession of equality and justice on the one hand and, on the other, the rather less edifying reality is very great. This is most easily demonstrated in international relations, which is the reason I have stressed them so much in these lectures. A couple of recent examples illustrate what I have in mind. During the period just after Iraq's illegal invasion of Kuwait in 1990, public discussion in the West justly focused on the unacceptability of the aggression, which with extreme brutality sought to eliminate Kuwaiti existence. And as it became clear that the American intention was in fact to use military force against Iraq, the public rhetoric encouraged processes at the United Nations that would ensure the passage of resolutions based on the UN Charter, demanding sanctions and the possible use of force against Iraq. Of the few intellectuals who opposed both the Iraqi invasion and the subsequent use of largely American force in Operation Desert Storm, none, to my knowledge, cited any evidence or made any argument actually excusing Iraq for what it did. But what I think was correctly remarked at the time was how considerably weakened the American case against Iraq was when the Bush administration, with its enormous power, pressed the UN forwards towards war, ignoring the numerous possibilities of a negotiated reversal of the occupation before January 15, when the counteroffensive began, and also refusing to discuss other UN resolutions on other illegal occupations and invasions of territory that had involved the United States itself or some of its close allies. Of course, the real issue in the Gulf, so far as the U.S. was concerned, was oil and strategic power, not the Bush administration's professed principles. But what compromised intellectual discussion throughout the country in its reiterations of the inadmissibility of land unilaterally acquired by force was the absence of universal application of the idea. What never seemed relevant to the many American intellectuals who supported the war was that the U.S. itself had just recently invaded and for a time occupied the sovereign state of Panama. Surely, if one criticized Iraq, it therefore followed that the U.S. deserved the same criticism. But no. Our motives were higher, Saddam was a Hitler, whereas we were moved by largely altruistic and disinterested motives, and therefore this was a just war. Or consider the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, equally wrong and equally condemnable. But U.S. allies such as Israel and Turkey had occupied territories illegally before the Russians moved into Afghanistan. Similarly, another U.S. ally, Indonesia, had massacred literally hundreds of thousands of Timorese in an illegal invasion during the middle 1970s. There is evidence to show that the U.S. knew about and supported the horrors of the East Timor War. But few intellectuals in the U.S., busy as always with the crimes of the Soviet Union, said much about that. And looming back in time was the enormous American invasion of Indochina, with results in sheer destructiveness wreaked on small, mainly peasant societies that are staggering. The principle here seems to have been that professional experts on U.S. foreign and military policy should confine their attention to winning a war against the other superpower and its surrogates in Vietnam or Afghanistan, and our own misdeeds be damned. Such are the ways of realpolitik. Certainly they are, but my point would be that for the contemporary intellectual living at a time that is already confused by the disappearance of what seem to have been objective moral norms and sensible authority, is it acceptable simply either blindly to support the behavior of one's own country and overlook its crimes, or to say rather supinely, I believe they all do it and that's the way of the world? What we must be able to say instead is that intellectuals are not just competent professionals, denatured by their fawning service to an extremely flawed powers, but, to repeat, are intellectuals with an alternative and more principled stand that enables them, in effect, to speak the truth to power. By that I do not mean here some Old Testament-like thunderings proclaiming everyone to be sinful and basically evil. I do mean something much more modest and a great deal more effective. To speak of consistency in upholding standards of international behavior and the support of human rights is not to look inwards for a guiding light supplied to one by inspiration or prophetic intuition. Most, if not all, countries in the world are signatories to a Universal Declaration of Human Rights adopted and proclaimed in 1948, reaffirmed by every new member state of the UN. There are equally solemn conventions on the rules of war, on treatment of prisoners, on the rights of workers, women, children, immigrants, and refugees. None of these documents says anything about disqualified or less equal races or peoples. All are entitled to the same freedoms. Of course, these rights are violated on a daily basis, as witness the genocide in Bosnia today. For an American or Egyptian or Chinese government official, these rights are at best looked at politically, not from a consistently moral standpoint. But those are the norms of power, which are precisely not those of the intellectual, whose role is at very least to apply the same standards and norms of behavior, now already collectively accepted on paper by the entire international community. Of course, there are patriotism and loyalty to one's people, and of course the intellectual is not an uncomplicated automaton, hurling mathematically devised laws and rules across the board. And of course, fear and the normal limitations on one's time and attention and capacity as an individual voice operate with fearsome efficiency. But I am trying to say that whereas we are right to bewail the disappearance of a consensus on what constitutes objectivity, we are not by the same token completely adrift in self-indulgent subjectivity. Taking refuge inside a profession or nationality, I've already said, is only taking refuge. It doesn't answer to the goads all of us receive just by reading the morning's news. No one can speak up all the time on all the issues, but I believe there is a special duty to address the constituted and authorized powers of one's own society, which are accountable to its citizenry, particularly when those powers are exercised in a manifestly disproportionate and immoral war, or in deliberate programs of discrimination, repression, and collective cruelty. As I said in my second lecture, all of us live inside national borders. We use national languages. We address, most of the time, our national communities. For an intellectual who lives in America, there's a further reality to be faced, namely that our country is first of all an extremely diverse immigrant society with fantastic resources and accomplishments, but also a redoubtable set of internal inequities and external interventions that cannot be turned away from. While I cannot speak for intellectuals elsewhere, surely something of the same sort obtains there as well, with the difference that in those cases the state in question is not a global power like the United States. In all these instances, the intellectual meaning of a situation is arrived at by comparing the known and available facts with a norm, also known and available. This is not an easy task, since documentation, research, probings are required in order to get beyond the usually piecemeal, fragmentary, and necessarily flawed way in which information is presented. But in most cases it is possible, I believe, to ascertain whether in fact a massacre was committed or an official cover-up produced. The first imperative is to find out what occurred and then why, not as isolated events, but as part of an unfolding history whose broad contours includes one's own nation as an actor. The incoherence of the standard foreign policy analysis performed by apologists, strategists, and planners is that it concentrates on others as the objects of the situation, rarely on our involvement and what it wrought. Even more rarely is it compared to a moral norm. The goal of speaking the truth is, in so administered a mass society as ours, mainly to project a better state of affairs, one that corresponds more closely to a set of moral principles applied to peace, reconciliation, abatement of suffering, applied to the known facts. This has been called abduction by the American philosopher C.S. Peirce, and has been used effectively by the celebrated contemporary intellectual Noam Chomsky. Certainly in writing and speaking, one's aim is not to show everyone how right one is, but in trying to induce a change in the moral climate whereby aggression is seen as such, the unjust punishment of peoples or individuals is either prevented or given up, the recognition of rights and democratic freedoms is established as a norm for everyone, not invidiously for a select few. Admittedly, however, these are idealistic and often unrealizable aims, and in a sense, they are not as immediately relevant to my subject here as the intellectual's individual performance, when, as I've been saying, the tendency too often is to back away or simply to toe the line. Nothing, in my view, is more reprehensible than those habits of mind in the intellectual that induce avoidance, that characteristic turning away from a difficult and principled position which you know to be the right one, but which you decide not to take. You do not want to appear too political, you are afraid of seeming controversial, you need the approval of a boss or an authority figure, you want to keep a reputation for being balanced, objective, moderate, your hope is to be asked back, to consult, to be on a board or prestigious committee, and so to remain within the responsible mainstream. Someday you hope to get an honorary degree, a big prize, perhaps even an ambassadorship. For an intellectual, these habits of mind are corrupting par excellence. If anything can denature, neutralize, and finally kill a passionate intellectual life, it is those considerations, internalized and, so to speak, in the driver's seat. And finally, a word about the mode of intellectual intervention. One doesn't climb a mountain or pulpit and declaim from the heights. Obviously, you want to speak your piece where it can be heard best, and also you want it represented in such a way as to affiliate with an ongoing and actual process, for instance, the cause of peace and justice. Yes, the intellectual's voice is lonely, but it has resonance only because it associates itself freely with the reality of a movement, the aspirations of a people, the common pursuit of a shared ideal. Let's look at an example. Opportunism dictates that in the West, much given to full-scale critiques of, for instance, Palestinian terror or immoderation, you denounce them soundly and then go on to praise Israeli democracy. Then you must say something good about peace. Yet, intellectual responsibility dictates, of course, that you say all those things directly to Palestinians. But your main point is made in New York, Paris, and London around the issue which in those places you can most affect by promoting the idea of Palestinian freedom and the freedom from terror and extremism of all concerned, not just the weakest and most easily bashed party. Speaking the truth to power is no Panglossian idealism. It is carefully weighing the alternatives, picking the right one, and then intelligently representing it where it can do the most good and cause the right change.
You've been listening to a podcast from the archives of the BBC Reith Lectures. For more podcasts, please visit bbc.co.uk/Radio4. This is a podcast from the archives of the BBC Reith Lectures. This lecture, in the series Representation of the Intellectual, given by Idwārd Saʿīd, was originally broadcast in 1993.
Some years ago, the versatile and ingenious French intellectual Reith wrote a penetrating account of French cultural life entitled teachers, writers, celebrities, the intellectuals of modern France. Debray himself had once been a seriously committed left-wing activist who had taught at the University of Havana shortly after the Cuban Revolution of 1958. Some years later, he was given a 30-year prison term by the Bolivian authorities because of his association with Che Guevara. Yet he only served 3 years of his sentence, and after his return to France, Debray became a semi-academic political analyst and later still an advisor to President Mitterrand. Debray's thesis in his book is that between 1880 and 1930, Parisian intellectuals were principally connected to the Sorbonne. They were secular refugees from both church and Bonapartism, where in laboratories, libraries, and classrooms, the intellectual, protected as a professor, could make important advances in knowledge. After 1930, the Sorbonne slowly lost its authority to new publishing houses like the Nouvelle Revue Française, where, according to Debray, the spiritual family, comprising the intelligentsia and their editors, was given a more hospitable roof over its head. Until roughly 1960, such writers as Sartre, de Beauvoir, Camus, Mauriac, Gide, and Malraux were in effect the intelligentsia who had superseded the professorate. Superseded them because of their free-ranging work, their credo of freedom, and their discourse that was midway between the ecclesiastical solemnity that went before it and the shrillness of the advertising that came after. Around 1968, intellectuals largely deserted their publishers' fold. Instead, they flocked to the mass media as journalists, talk show guests and hosts, advisors, managers, and so on. Not only did they now have a huge mass audience, but also their entire life work as intellectuals depended on their viewers, on acclaim or oblivion as given by those others who had become a faceless consuming audience out there. Debray says, by extending the reception area, the mass media have reduced the sources of intellectual legitimacy surrounding the professional intelligentsia, the classic source of legitimacy, with wider concentric circles that are less demanding and therefore more easily won over. What Debray describes is almost entirely a local French situation, the result of a struggle between secular, imperial, and ecclesiastical forces in that society since Napoleon. It is therefore most unlikely to duplicate the picture he provides for France in other societies. In Britain, for example, the major universities before World War II could hardly be characterized in Debray's terms, since even Oxford and Cambridge dons were not principally known in the public domain as intellectuals in the French sense. And, although British publishing houses were powerful and influential between the two world wars, they and their authors did not constitute the spiritual family Debray speaks about in France. Nevertheless, the general point is a valid one. Groups of individuals are aligned with institutions and derive power and authority from those institutions. As the institutions either rise or fall in ascendancy, so too do their organic intellectuals who work inside them. And yet the question remains as to whether there is or can be anything like an independent, autonomously functioning intellectual, one who is not beholden to and therefore constrained by his or her affiliations with universities that pay salaries, political parties that demand loyalty to a party line, think tanks that, while they offer freedom to do research, perhaps more subtly compromise judgment and restrain the critical voice. As Debray suggests, once an intellectual circle is widened beyond the like group of intellectuals, in other words, if instead of depending on other intellectuals for debate and judgment, and one starts instead to worry about pleasing an audience or an employer, something in the intellectual's vocation is, if not abrogated, then certainly inhibited. We come back once again to the main theme of these lectures, the representation of the intellectual. When we think of an individual intellectual, the individual is my principal concern here, do we accentuate the individuality of the person in drawing his or her portrait? Or do we rather make our focus the group or class of which the individual is a member? The answer to this question obviously affects our expectations of the intellectual's address to us. Is what we hear or read an independent view, or does it represent a government, an organized political cause, a lobbying group? 19th century representations of the intellectual tended to stress individuality, the fact that very often the intellectual is, like Turgenev's Bazarov, or James Joyce's Stephen Dedalus, a solitary, somehow aloof figure, who does not conform to society at all, and is consequently a rebel completely outside established opinion. With the increased number of 20th century men and women who belong to a general group called intellectuals, or the intelligentsia, the managers, professors, journalists, computer or government experts, lobbyists, pundits, syndicated columnists, consultants who are paid for their opinions, one is impelled to wonder whether the individual intellectual as an independent voice can exist at all. This is a tremendously important question, I think, and it must be looked into with a combination of realism and idealism, certainly not cynicism. A cynic, Oscar Wilde says, is someone who knows the price of everything but the value of nothing. To accuse all intellectuals of being sellouts just because they earn their living working in a university or for a newspaper is a coarse and finally meaningless charge. Thus, it would be far too indiscriminately cynical to say that the world is so corrupt that everyone ultimately succumbs to mammon. On the other hand, it's scarcely less serious to hold up the individual intellectual as a perfect ideal, a sort of shining knight who is so pure and so noble as to deflect any suspicion of material interest. No one can pass such a test, not even Joyce's Dedalus, who is so pure and fiercely ideal as in the end to be incapacitated and, worse, silent. The fact is that the intellectual ought neither to be so uncontroversial and safe a figure as to be just a friendly technician, nor, going in the opposite direction, should the intellectual try to be a full-time Cassandra, as unpleasant in being right as she was, and as unheard as well. Every human being is held in by society, no matter how free and open the society, no matter how bohemian the individual. In any case, the intellectual is supposed to be heard from, and in practice ought to be stirring up debate and, if possible, controversy. But the alternatives are not total quiescence or total rebelliousness. During the waning days of the Reagan administration, a disaffected left-wing American intellectual called Russell Jacoby published a book that generated a great deal of discussion, much of it approving. It was called The Last Intellectuals, and argued the unimpeachable thesis that in the United States the non-academic intellectual had completely disappeared, leaving no one in that place except a whole bunch of timid and jargon-ridden university dons to whom no one in the society paid any attention. Jacoby's model for the intellectual of yore was comprised of a few names that lived mostly in Greenwich Village, the local equivalent of the Latin Quarter, earlier this century, and were known by the general name of the New York intellectuals. Most of them were Jewish, left-wing but anti-communist, and managed to live by their pens. Figures of the earlier generation included men and women like Edmund Wilson, Jane Jacobs, Lewis Mumford, Dwight MacDonald. Their later counterparts were Philip Roth, Alfred Kazin, Irving Howe, who died only a few weeks ago, Susan Sontag, Daniel Bell, William Barrett, Lionel Trilling. According to Jacoby, the likes of such people has been diminished by various post-war social and political forces. The flight to the suburbs, Jacoby's point being that the intellectual is an urban creature, the irresponsibilities of the beat generation who pioneered the idea of dropping out and fleeing from their appointed station in life, the expansion of the university, and a drift to the campus of the former American left. The result is that today's intellectual is most likely to be a closeted literature professor with a secure income and no interest in dealing with the world outside the classroom. Such individuals, Jacoby alleges, write an esoteric and barbaric prose that is meant mainly for academic advancement and not for social change. Meanwhile, the ascendancy of what has been called the neoconservative movement, intellectuals who had become prominent during the Reagan period, but who were in many cases former left-wing independent intellectuals like Irving Kristol and Sidney Hook, brought with it a whole host of new journals advancing an openly reactionary, or at least conservative, social agenda. Jacoby mentions the extreme right-wing quarterly, The New Criterion, in particular. These new forces, says Jacoby, were and still are much more assiduous at courting young writers